A guy gets hit by a truck, wakes up in another world, and suddenly his life matters, which is ridiculous. But for such a silly premise, Isekai keeps circling some weirdly serious ideas: failed lives, sudden deaths, second chances, and worlds where effort actually means something. So maybe the genre is not just about escaping into fantasy. Maybe it's asking a much more uncomfortable question. What are we really escaping from? Take Mushoku Tensei, and before anyone gets mad, no, I'm not here to defend Rudeus, rank the waifus, or pretend this show is not extremely weird. So let's start smaller. Before the swords, magic, demons, adventures, and all the fantasy stuff we usually associate with Isekai, Mushoku Tensei begins with a room. Not a grand portal, not a heroic prophecy, not some goofy goddess explaining the rules of the new world. A room, a life that has collapsed inward. The man who will be reborn as Rudeus is not introduced as a brave hero waiting for his chance. He is introduced as someone who has already given up on himself. His old life is marked by shame, isolation, withdrawal, regret, and the horrible feeling that life has kept moving, but he has not. Usually, we think the isekai fantasy starts when the protagonist wakes up in another world, but emotionally, it starts way earlier. It starts when the old life becomes unbearable, and the problem is no longer just where you are, but who you have become there. And that changes the question. Because at first, isekai looks like it's asking, wouldn't it be cool to live in a fantasy world? And yeah, obviously, it would be cool to cast spells, fight monsters, build kingdoms, and solve the world's problems with the power of friendship. But Mushoku Tensei pushes us toward a darker question. What kind of life makes another life feel necessary? Before the second chance, there is a life he cannot bear. The fantasy is not just transportation, it's interruption. And in isekai, that interruption can look almost stupidly casual. A truck hits someone, someone gets summoned, someone gets stabbed by a random dude in the street. The genre has this weird talent for making death feel like slapstick. 1 second, you're in the real world. Next second, character creation menu. But death in these stories is not just an ending, it's a cut. The moment one life stops, another one becomes possible. But here's the catch. Mushoku Tensei does not give Rudeus a clean reset. He remembers. If Rebirth were a total blank slate, the fantasy would be much simpler. The old life disappears, the new life begins. Clean reset. Problem solved. But memory makes the second life stranger than that. It's not a blank page, it's a second attempt, haunted by the first one. That's why the point is not just, now I have magic. The point is that rebirth creates distance from the person who failed. A power fantasy asks, what if I was strong? A revenge fantasy asks, what if everyone who ignored me finally regretted it? But this fantasy asks something way more intimate. What if my worst version was not the final version? And this is where philosophy gives us a useful word. Kierkegaard calls it despair. But Kierkegaard does not mean despair in the casual way we usually use it. He's not just talking about feeling sad, having a bad week, or watching short-form content until you knock yourself to sleep. For Kierkegaard, despair is not just a mood. It's a broken relationship to the self, being unable to live with who you are, or trying to escape being yourself altogether. And I'm not saying isekai solves despair in Kierkegaard's sense. A reincarnation menu is not therapy or philosophy, but isekai dramatizes one part of that wound very clearly. The feeling that your life is not just bad, but that you have become someone you never meant to be. And isekai turns that feeling into a very simple story mechanic. You die here and wake up somewhere where your past is no longer the whole story. New name, new world, new chance. That's why the fantasy is seductive, but also why it can't be simply self-deletion. If despair is a broken relation to the self, then erasing the self does not heal it. It only repeats the desire not to be yourself. Which is a very serious way of talking about a genre where the solution is often a truck. And yes, the truck is silly. The reincarnation rules are ridiculous. The fantasy worlds can be generic as hell. But underneath all that, there is a very real fear. What if I already wasted my chance? What if the person I became is the person I am stuck being? What if life has already moved on without me? And Isekai answers that fear with one of the most comforting fantasies imaginable. No, not yet. The story is not over. The person you have become does not have to be the person you remain. So what are we really escaping from? At first, maybe not dragons, school, work, or the harsh reality of the world. Maybe the first escape is from the self we are afraid we have already become. But another self is not enough. Once that chance appears, a new question opens up immediately. Where can that new self actually live? So what kind of world would make that new life actually worth living? At first, the answer seems obvious. A better world, a safer world, a nicer one, a place with magic, adventure, cute companions, and of course, plot. But a lot of isekai worlds are not actually nicer. They're dangerous, violent, and unfair. The kind of places that would probably make most of us miss the modern hell of our own time. So maybe the fantasy is not safety. Maybe it's readability. A world where effort leaves marks, where failure teaches you something, where your choices do not just vanish into the air. And you can see this more clearly if you put two very different shows next to each other. That Time I Got Reincarnated as a slime, and ReZero starting life in another world. They barely feel like the same fantasy. In Slime, the setup is almost a joke. A man dies and wakes up as a slime. Not a knight, not a prince, not a chosen hero, a slime. A little blue blob. The kind of creature most fantasy worlds treat like tutorial garbage. Something you defeat before the real story even begins. But that's the trick. Rimuru looks weak, but the world does not treat that weakness as the final word. The slime body becomes something else, a body that can absorb, learn, adapt, and grow. What first looks like the lowest creature in the fantasy food chain becomes a godlike figure. So yes, slime is absolutely a power fantasy. But Rimuru's power does not only become domination, it becomes construction. Rimuru creates a settlement that becomes a community, then a nation where creatures usually treated as enemies, pests, and outsiders can live together. That's the real warmth of Slime. Slime is not only asking what if I became powerful, it's asking what if power meant I could finally build somewhere to belong. Then there's ReZero, and ReZero looks almost like the opposite fantasy. Subaru is also thrown into another world, but he is not Rimuru. He does not become powerful enough to bend the world in his image. At first, he's just a normal guy who assumes, because he has landed in a fantasy world, that he must be the main character now. And the world punishes that assumption brutally. Subaru's special ability is called Return by Death. The idea is simple and horrible. When he dies, he wakes up at an earlier point in time. The world resets, but only he remembers what happened. So his second chance is not comfort, it's trauma with a save point. He has to relive situations that killed him, carrying knowledge nobody else remembers. Every failure costs him, but every failure also teaches him something about the world. His second chance is not what if life became easy, it is what if suffering became information. What if every death revealed the rules a little more clearly? This is what makes ReZero so different from Slime. Subaru does not get a world he can easily build into a home. He gets a world that breaks him until he learns how it works. The world is cruel, but it is not meaningless, so the two shows only look like opposites. Slime gives us belonging. ReZero gives us consequence. One confronts through construction, the other through pain becoming knowledge. But underneath both is the same promise. What you do matters here. And this is where Camus gives us the sharper version of the problem. For Camus, the absurdity of life begins with a clash. Human beings want meaning, clarity, and order, but the world does not naturally answer that need. That word matters, answer. Because one of the deepest wounds of ordinary life is not always pain, it is silence. In real life, effort does not always become progress. Pain does not always become wisdom. Work does not always become recognition. You can try to improve and still not know if you're becoming anything. You can pour years into becoming better, and the world can respond with a shrug and an email that starts with "unfortunately." That is part of what makes real life so hard to narrate. The connection between effort and outcome is messy. You can do the right things and still lose. You can waste time and somehow be rewarded. You can try to become someone better and still feel like the same idiot, just with slightly more self-awareness and worse posture. That is the ache Isekai reverses. Isekai imagines a world that is not silent, not always kind. ReZero is proof of that. Not always safe, not always fair, but responsive. In Slime, power becomes home. In ReZero, suffering becomes knowledge. The shared fantasy is not comfort, it's feedback. The world does not become easy, it becomes readable. This choice led here, this failure taught me that, this place changed because I was here. That's why the Isekai world can feel more inhabitable even if it's more dangerous. Because danger is not the opposite of meaning. Indifference is. A monster can kill you, a curse can break you, a timeline can crush you. But if your choices still matter inside that world, then the world is no longer silent. It answers back. And once you put all of that next to what we talked about in Act 1, a larger pattern starts to emerge. Hey, if you're enjoying this video, consider subscribing. It helps me keep going. A failed self, a world that doesn't answer, death as a doorway, pain answered on the other side. At a certain point, Isekai stops looking like ordinary escapism and starts looking like something much older. Wait, did Isekai just reinvent heaven? Not literally. Truckon is not Jesus, a stat screen is not divine grace, and a busty goddess explaining your death is not exactly a serious theology on the afterlife, but the shape is hard to ignore. And I want to be careful here. I do not mean one specific religion, one clean allegory, or every tradition secretly saying the same thing. I mean heaven in the broad, emotional sense, the hope that this world is not the final measure of reality. That is the thing Isekai keeps brushing against. Because Isekai did not invent the connection between death, rebirth, and another world. Those ideas were already there. Akiko Komura points out that another world and reincarnation already exist in Japanese religious cultural traditions, but Isekai changes their emotional meaning. In Buddhism, being reborn again is not exactly the happy ending, it's part of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that keeps you trapped in suffering, not free from it. But in Isekai, Rebirth often becomes positive. A person dies here, wakes up there, and death becomes the doorway into powers, possibilities, and a new story. That is the important shift. Isekai takes all the religious material, death, rebirth, another world, and changes its emotional function. Rebirth stops being a burden, it becomes a reward. Death stops being only an ending, it becomes the beginning of a better story. That is why Isekai feels so modern and so old at the same time. On the surface, it speaks very clearly to modern life. Burnout, loneliness, work anxiety, the loss of community, the feeling that meaning is no longer guaranteed from above. But modern life does not create the need for something heaven-like, it exposes it. Even when belief weakens, the emotional need that belief answered does not necessarily disappear. The desire for another world does not disappear. The hope that suffering might be answered somewhere beyond ordinary life does not disappear. Isekai gives people something heaven-shaped without asking them to become religious. Isekai is what heaven looks like when belief becomes a genre. And the genre part matters, because Isekai does not present heaven seriously. It puts heaven in a costume. A truck, a clumsy goddess, a stat screen, a cheat skill. The point is not just that these tropes are silly, the point is that the silliness creates distance, because saying that desire directly would feel too vulnerable. I want another world. I want this life not to be final. I want the pain of this world to be answered somewhere beyond it. That sounds religious, naive, childish, embarrassing, too sincere. So Isekai makes the desire ridiculous enough to enjoy. The truck makes rebirth absurd. The stat screen makes divine grace look like game design. The goddess turns providence into customer support. And because of that mask, the viewer does not have to believe in heaven to feel something heaven-shaped. No doctrine, no worship, no confession of faith, just emotional fulfillment. That is why Isekai can be stupid and serious at the same time. The joke protects the seriousness, the ridiculousness makes the longing safe. And maybe that's why reducing Isekai to escapism feels too small. Because yes, Isekai is escape, but what are we really escaping from? Not just work, not just boredom, not the failed self, not even the silence of the real world, but the fear that this world is the only world. The fear that suffering has no beyond, that death is only closure, that reality has no second layer, that there is nowhere for the pain of this life to be answered. And Isekai answers that fear in the most ridiculous modern form possible, not by asking us to believe in heaven, but by giving us a version of it we can still feel.